What happens when the most powerful woman in Alabama finds herself face to face with the one person who can see through her carefully constructed facade? In the sweltering summer of 1821, on the Whitmore plantation where cotton was king and human lives were currency, a single locked door would become the stage for a confrontation that would shatter illusions, expose hidden truths, and reveal the devastating cost of a system built on human bondage. This is not a love story. This is a story about power, vulnerability, and the dangerous moment when two people trapped in an inhuman system are forced to see each other as human beings. If stories that dive deep into the darkest chapters of American history captivate you, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon, because today's tale will take you on a journey through the complex web of power, oppression, and unexpected humanity that defined the antebellum South. The Alabama sun rose like a merciless god over the Whitmore plantation on August 15, 1821, casting long shadows across 800 acres of prime cotton land. The morning air was already thick with humidity that would only grow more oppressive as the day progressed. But for the 137 enslaved souls who called this place their prison, the weather was the least of their concerns. Samuel Washington, though his surname was one he had given himself, never acknowledged by his owners, had been awake since before dawn. At 18, he had already spent more than half his life understanding that survival meant anticipating the needs and moods of white people before they even knew them themselves. The scars on his back, faded now but still visible in the right light, served as permanent reminders of the consequences of miscalculation. The slave quarters were a collection of rough wooden cabins arranged in two neat rows behind the main house, each structure housing anywhere from 6 to 12 people, depending on family size and the master's current economic situation. Samuel shared his cabin with his uncle Moses, a man of 45 whose spirit had been systematically broken over decades of bondage, and 3 other men whose names changed periodically as people were bought, sold, or died. The morning routine was always the same. Before the overseer's horn sounded at 5 o'clock, Samuel would slip quietly from his straw mattress and make his way to the well behind the quarters. The few minutes of solitude before the day's brutality began were precious beyond measure. Moments when he could think his own thoughts, remember fragments of the stories his grandmother had told him about Africa before she died, and steel himself for another day of dehumanization. This particular morning, as Samuel drew water from the well, he noticed something different in the main house. A light flickered in the upper window of what he knew to be Mrs. Whitmore's private sitting room. It was unusual for any of the White family to be awake this early, and Samuel filed the observation away with the countless other details he collected daily, information that might someday mean the difference between life and death. The horn sounded across the plantation like a death knell, and immediately the quarters came alive with movement. Men, women, and children emerged from the cabins, their faces already set in the masks of compliance that slavery demanded. Samuel joined the stream of people moving toward the fields, his mind already calculating the day's work, the overseer's likely mood, and the 100 small decisions that would determine whether he would end the day with food in his belly or welts on his back. Mr. Jeremiah Hutchins, the plantation's overseer, was a man who had found his calling in the systematic brutalization of other human beings. At 38, he had spent 15 years perfecting the art of extracting maximum labor while maintaining just enough humanity in his charges to keep them productive. He was neither the cruelest nor the kindest overseer in the county. He was simply efficient, and that efficiency had made him valuable to Governor James Whitmore. Hutchins rode his horse along the edge of the cotton fields as the enslaved workers spread out across the endless rows of white bolls. His presence was a constant reminder of the violence that underscored every aspect of plantation life. The whip at his side was not merely symbolic. It was a tool he used with calculated precision, never enough to permanently disable valuable property, but always enough to maintain absolute control. Samuel had learned to work within Hutchins' system of terror. He picked cotton with mechanical efficiency, his hands moving with the practiced speed that came from years of repetition. He kept his eyes down, his mouth shut, and his thoughts carefully hidden behind a mask of compliance. But beneath the surface, his mind was always working. always observing, always looking for the patterns and opportunities that might someday lead to something better. The other enslaved workers moved through the fields like ghosts, their individual personalities subsumed into the collective identity of property. There was Sarah, a woman of 30, who had been separated from her children when they were sold to a plantation in Mississippi. There was old Tom, whose real name was Thomas Jefferson, a cruel joke by a previous owner who had been working these fields since before Samuel was born. There was Mary, barely 16, whose beauty had already marked her for the special attention that no enslaved woman could refuse. Each of them carried their own stories of loss, trauma, and survival. Each had developed their own strategies for maintaining some fragment of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. And each understood that their survival depended not just on their own actions, but on the collective ability of the enslaved community to protect and support one another within the constraints of their bondage. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore had been born Margaret Thornton in Charleston, South Carolina, the daughter of a rice planter whose wealth had been built on the labor of enslaved people for 3 generations. At 20, she had married James Whitmore in a union that had more to do with political alliance and economic advantage than with any romantic sentiment. Now, at 32, she was the wife of Alabama's governor and one of the most powerful women in the state. Her life was a carefully choreographed performance of Southern womanhood. She managed a household staff of 12 enslaved people, entertained the wives of politicians and planters, and maintained the facade of genteel perfection that her position demanded. Her days were filled with the minutiae of domestic management, overseeing meal preparation, managing the household budget, and ensuring that every aspect of the Whitmore plantation reflected the family's status and wealth. But beneath the layers of silk and social propriety, Margaret struggled with a growing sense of emptiness that she could neither name nor escape. Her marriage to James was cordial but cold, a business partnership disguised as a romantic union. She had suffered 3 miscarriages in 12 years of marriage, each loss deepening her sense of failure and isolation. Her social circle consisted entirely of other plantation wives, whose conversations rarely ventured beyond gossip, fashion, and the management of enslaved labor. On this particular morning, Margaret stood at her bedroom window watching the enslaved workers move toward the fields. It was a sight she had witnessed thousands of times, but recently she had found herself paying closer attention to the individual faces, wondering about the thoughts and feelings hidden behind their masks of compliance. Her attention was drawn to one figure in particular, a young man whose posture and movement suggested a strength that hadn't been completely broken by bondage. She had noticed him before, though she couldn't say exactly when or why he had first caught her attention. There was something in his bearing, something in the way he carried himself even under the weight of oppression, that intrigued her. Margaret turned away from the window, disturbed by her own thoughts. It was dangerous to see enslaved people as individuals, dangerous to wonder about their inner lives. The entire system of slavery depended on the fiction that they were property rather than people, and any crack in that fiction threatened the foundation of her world. By noon, the Alabama sun had transformed the cotton fields into a furnace. The temperature had climbed past 90 degrees, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. The enslaved workers continued their labor, their bodies moving with the mechanical persistence that slavery demanded. But the heat was taking its toll. Samuel's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were beginning to blister from the rough cotton bowls. He had been picking since dawn, with only a brief break for a meager breakfast of cornbread and molasses. His back ached from bending over the cotton plants, and his throat was parched despite the occasional sips of warm water from the communal bucket. Around him, the other workers moved through their own private hells. Sarah had collapsed twice from the heat, but had forced herself back to her feet rather than risk Hutchins' attention. Old Tom's breathing was labored, and Samuel could see the older man struggling to maintain the pace that would keep him safe from punishment. Mary worked with tears streaming down her face, though whether from the heat, exhaustion, or despair, Samuel couldn't tell. Hutchins rode his circuit through the fields, his presence a constant reminder of the violence that awaited anyone who faltered. He carried a leather water bottle, and occasionally took long drinks, the sound of the liquid sloshing a cruel counterpoint to the workers' thirst. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that settled on the worker's already grimy skin. "You there, boy?" Hutchins called out, pointing his whip at Samuel. "You're falling behind." Samuel looked up briefly, just long enough to acknowledge the overseer's words, then bent back to his work with renewed intensity. He had learned long ago that arguing or explaining was pointless. The only response that mattered was increased productivity. But as he worked, Samuel's mind wandered to thoughts of escape, of freedom, of a life where his labor would benefit himself rather than enriching others. These were dangerous thoughts, thoughts that could get him killed if they were ever discovered, but they were also the thoughts that kept him sane in an insane world. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, something unusual happened. A messenger arrived from Montgomery with urgent political correspondence for Governor Whitmore, who had been expected to return from the state capital that evening. The messenger brought word that the governor would be delayed for at least another day, possibly 2 due to legislative business that required his immediate attention. The news rippled through the plantation hierarchy with varying effects. For Hutchins, it meant a slight relaxation of the rigid schedule that governed plantation life when the master was in residence. For the house slaves, it meant a temporary reprieve from the heightened scrutiny that accompanied the governor's presence. And for the field hands, it meant the possibility, just the possibility, of slightly less brutal working conditions. Hutchins made the decision to allow the workers an extended rest period during the hottest part of the afternoon. It was a calculated choice. Heat exhaustion could kill valuable property, and dead slaves generated no profit. The workers were allowed to seek shade under the large oak trees that bordered the fields, and additional water was brought from the well. Samuel found himself sitting in the shade next to old Tom, both men too exhausted to speak, but grateful for the temporary relief. Around them, other workers lay sprawled on the ground, their bodies finally allowed to acknowledge the toll that the heat and labor had taken. "Boy's got his eye on you," old Tom whispered, so quietly that Samuel almost missed the words. Samuel followed the older man's gaze and saw Hutchins watching him from across the field. The overseer's attention was never a good thing, and Samuel felt a chill of fear despite the oppressive heat. "What you think he wants?" Samuel asked. "Don't matter what he wants," old Tom replied. "Matters what you do about it. Keep your head down, do your work, and pray he finds someone else to focus on." But even as old Tom spoke the words, both men knew that sometimes prayer wasn't enough. Sometimes the attention of white people, whether benevolent or malevolent, was simply unavoidable. And when that attention came, survival depended on navigating a maze of unspoken rules and deadly consequences. While the field hands rested in whatever shade they could find, life in the main house continued according to its own rhythms. The Whitmore mansion was a testament to the wealth that could be extracted from human bondage. 2 stories of white-painted wood and brick, with wide verandas and tall windows, designed to catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the Alabama heat. Margaret spent her afternoon in the relative coolness of the house's interior, managing the domestic details that kept the plantation running smoothly. She reviewed the weekly accounts with Bessie, the enslaved woman who served as head cook, discussing meal planning and supply needs. She inspected the work of the house slaves who were responsible for cleaning and maintaining the family's living spaces. She wrote letters to other plantation wives, maintaining the social connections that were essential to her husband's political career. But throughout these routine activities, Margaret found her thoughts returning to the scene she had witnessed from her bedroom window that morning. The image of the young man in the fields lingered in her mind, though she couldn't explain why. There had been something in his posture, something in the way he moved, that had captured her attention in a way that made her uncomfortable. Margaret had been raised to see enslaved people as a necessary part of the natural order, no different from livestock or farm equipment. They were property to be managed efficiently and humanely, but property nonetheless. The idea that they might have inner lives, hopes, dreams, or desires was not something she had been encouraged to consider. But lately, she had found herself wondering about the people who surrounded her daily life. What did Bessie think about as she prepared meals in the kitchen? What dreams did the young women who cleaned her bedroom harbor? What hopes sustained the men who worked in the fields under the brutal Alabama sun? These were dangerous thoughts for a woman in her position. The entire social and economic structure of the South depended on maintaining clear boundaries between white and black, master and slave, human and property. Any blurring of those lines threatened not just individual relationships, but the entire system that provided her with wealth, status, and security. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself drawn repeatedly to the windows that overlooked the fields. She told herself she was simply checking on the progress of the work, ensuring that the plantation's most valuable assets were being properly managed. But she knew, even as she rationalized her behavior, that she was looking for one particular figure among the workers. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the cotton fields, Hutchins finally called an end to the day's labor. The enslaved workers gathered their tools and began the slow walk back to the quarters, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits lifted slightly by the prospect of a few hours of relative freedom before the next day's ordeal began. Samuel walked with the others, but his mind was already focused on a plan he had been developing throughout the afternoon. The unusual circumstances of the day, the governor's absence, Hutchins's slightly relaxed supervision, the extended rest period, had created an opportunity that might not come again for weeks or months. Behind the slave quarters, in a small wooden structure that served multiple purposes, there was a space where Samuel had occasionally been able to find a few minutes of privacy. The building was used primarily for storage, but it also contained a large wooden tub that was sometimes used for washing clothes or, on very rare occasions, for the luxury of a proper bath. Samuel had been planning this moment for days, carefully observing the routines of the overseers and house staff, looking for a window of time when he might be able to steal a few minutes of solitude. The combination of the governor's absence and the day's unusual schedule had created exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. As the other workers dispersed to their cabins for the evening meal, Samuel quietly made his way to the storage building. He had already hidden a bucket and some soap, precious commodities that he had acquired through careful trading and saving. The prospect of washing away the day's accumulation of sweat, dirt, and cotton dust was almost overwhelming in its appeal. The small building was dimly lit by the fading daylight that filtered through a single window. Samuel moved quickly but quietly, filling the wooden tub with water he had drawn from the well earlier in the day. The water was barely warm, but it represented a luxury that was almost unimaginable in his daily existence. As he began to remove his work clothes, Samuel felt a sense of anticipation that went beyond the simple pleasure of cleanliness. For these few minutes, he would be able to exist as something other than property. He would be able to think his own thoughts, feel his own feelings, and experience his own humanity without the constant surveillance and control that defined every other moment of his life. The water felt like salvation against Samuel's skin. As he lowered himself into the wooden tub, he could feel the day's accumulation of sweat, dirt, and despair beginning to wash away. The sensation was so overwhelming that he had to close his eyes and concentrate on breathing steadily to avoid being overcome by emotion. This was more than just a bath. It was a ritual of reclamation, a brief assertion of his humanity in a world that denied it at every turn. For these precious minutes, he was not Governor Whitmore's property or Hutchins' target or the cotton fields machine. He was simply Samuel, a young man trying to maintain some fragment of dignity in an undignified world. As he washed, Samuel allowed his mind to wander to thoughts and memories that he normally kept carefully suppressed. He thought about his grandmother, who had died when he was 12, and the stories she had told him about their family's history. She had spoken of ancestors who had been kings and queens in Africa, of a time when their people had been free and proud and powerful. He thought about the books he had seen in the main house and the burning desire he felt to learn to read the words that held so much power in the white world. He had managed to learn a few letters by watching the white children's lessons from a distance, but the penalty for a slave-court reading was severe enough to make further education a dangerous dream. He thought about freedom, not just the abstract concept, but the practical reality of what it might mean. The ability to choose where to go and what to do. The right to keep the fruits of his own labor. The possibility of love and family, and all the human experiences that slavery made impossible. These thoughts were dangerous, Samuel knew. Hope was a luxury that enslaved people could rarely afford, because hope made the reality of bondage even more unbearable. But in this moment, surrounded by warm water and temporary solitude, he allowed himself to imagine a different life. The sound of his own breathing seemed loud in the small space, and Samuel found himself listening carefully for any indication that his privacy had been discovered. The consequences of being caught in such a vulnerable state would be severe, not just for the unauthorized use of water and soap, but for the implicit assertion of humanity that the act represented. Margaret Whitmore had spent the late afternoon in a state of increasing restlessness. With her husband away and the usual social obligations suspended, she found herself with an unusual amount of unstructured time. She had tried to occupy herself with needlework, with correspondence, with the endless small tasks that filled a plantation mistress's days, but nothing could distract her from the strange mood that had settled over her. As evening approached, Margaret found herself walking through the house with no particular destination in mind. She moved from room to room, ostensibly checking on the work of the house slaves, but actually seeking something she couldn't name. The familiar spaces felt different somehow, charged with a tension she didn't understand. Eventually, her wandering brought her to the back of the house, where large windows overlooked the slave quarters and the various outbuildings that supported the plantation's operations. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and most of the enslaved workers had disappeared into their cabins for the evening. But as Margaret stood at the window, she noticed a light flickering in one of the storage buildings. It was unusual. The building was rarely used in the evening, and there was no reason for any of the slaves to be there at this hour. Her first thought was that someone might be stealing supplies, a concern that would require immediate investigation. Margaret made her way out of the house and across the yard, her silk slippers making soft sounds on the packed earth. As she approached the storage building, she could hear the gentle sound of water moving, and she realized that someone was using the washing tub that was kept there. The rational response would have been to call for Hutchins or one of the other overseers to investigate. The use of plantation facilities without permission was a serious offense, and the punishment would be swift and severe. But something held Margaret back from raising an alarm. Instead, she found herself moving closer to the building, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't explain. Through a gap in the wooden walls, Margaret could see into the dimly lit interior. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A young man, the same young man she had noticed in the fields that morning, was bathing in the wooden tub, his dark skin glistening in the flickering light of a small candle. Margaret knew she should leave immediately. The sight of a naked enslaved man was not something a proper Southern lady should witness, and her presence here could be misinterpreted in ways that would be dangerous for both of them. But she found herself frozen in place, unable to look away from the scene before her. There was something in the young man's posture, something in the careful way he moved, that spoke to a dignity and humanity that the plantation system was designed to destroy. For the first time in her life, Margaret was seeing one of her husband's slaves not as property, but as a person with his own thoughts, feelings, and desires. Margaret stood outside the storage building for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching through the gap in the walls as Samuel continued his bath. She knew she should leave, knew that her presence here was inappropriate and potentially dangerous, but she found herself unable to move. The young man in the tub seemed completely unaware of her presence. His eyes were closed, and his face wore an expression of peace that Margaret had never seen on the face of any enslaved person. It was a reminder that beneath the masks of compliance and submission that slavery demanded, there were real people, with real emotions and real needs. As she watched, Margaret felt something shifting inside her, a crack in the carefully constructed worldview that had shaped her entire life. For 32 years, she had accepted without question the idea that enslaved people were fundamentally different from white people, that they were naturally suited for bondage and incapable of the full range of human emotion and experience. But the scene before her challenged every assumption she had ever held. The young man's obvious enjoyment of the simple pleasure of cleanliness, his careful attention to his own body, his moment of peaceful solitude, all of these things spoke to a humanity that was impossible to deny. Margaret found herself thinking about her own life, about the ways in which she too was trapped by the expectations and limitations of her society. She thought about her loveless marriage, her failed pregnancies, her days filled with meaningless social obligations and domestic management. She thought about the loneliness that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. The realization that she and the young man in the tub might have more in common than she had ever imagined was both thrilling and terrifying. It suggested possibilities that she had never considered, connections that transcended the rigid boundaries of race and class that governed Southern society. But it also suggested dangers that could destroy both of their lives. Margaret knew that she was standing at a crossroads. She could turn around and walk away, pretend that she had never seen what she had seen, and return to the safe but empty routine of her previous life. Or she could step forward into unknown territory, acknowledging the humanity she had witnessed and accepting the consequences of that acknowledgement. The choice she made in the next few moments would change everything. Margaret reached for the door handle, her hand trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She turned the handle slowly, trying to minimize the sound of the hinges, and stepped into the small building. The sound of the door opening was like a gunshot in the quiet space. Samuel's eyes flew open, and he spun toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs as he saw the silhouette of a woman in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved, frozen in a tableau that captured all the contradictions and dangers of their world. Samuel's first instinct was panic. Being discovered naked and vulnerable by any white person was dangerous enough, but being discovered by the governor's wife was potentially fatal. His mind raced through possible explanations, possible excuses, possible ways to minimize the catastrophe that was unfolding. Margaret stepped fully into the room and, without taking her eyes off Samuel, reached behind her and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place seemed to echo in the small space, and Samuel realized with growing horror that his situation had just become infinitely worse. "Mrs. Whitmore," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. I was just—" "I know what you were doing," Margaret interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The question is, what am I doing here?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither dared to voice. Samuel pressed himself against the far wall of the tub, trying to cover himself with his hands while simultaneously looking for any possible escape route. But the small room offered no refuge, and Margaret's presence blocked the only exit. "Please, ma'am," Samuel said, his voice breaking with fear. "I ain't done nothing wrong. I was just trying to get clean before—" "Before what?" Margaret's voice was softer now, almost curious. "Before you go back to your cabin, before you disappear into the quarters where I'll never see you again." The words revealed more than Margaret had intended, and both of them recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. The admission that she had been watching him, thinking about him, was a crack in the facade of proper Southern womanhood that could have devastating consequences. Samuel stared at her, trying to understand what was happening, what she wanted from him. In his 18 years of life, he had learned to read the moods and intentions of white people as a matter of survival, but Margaret's behavior was unlike anything he had ever encountered. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think maybe you should go back to the house if someone was to find you here." "If someone was to find me here," Margaret finished, "they would assume that you had attacked me. They would assume that you had forced yourself on a defenseless white woman, and you would be dead before morning." The brutal truth of her words settled over both of them like a shroud. The power dynamic was absolute. She could destroy him with a word, end his life with a simple accusation. But her presence here, her decision to enter the room and close the door behind her, had created a situation that was dangerous for both of them. "So why are you here?" Samuel asked, finding courage he didn't know he possessed. Margaret paused, the question forcing her to confront motivations she hadn't fully examined. "I don't know," she said finally, and the honesty in her voice was more frightening than any threat could have been. The silence that followed Margaret's admission stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, the plantation continued its evening routine. The sound of voices from the slave quarters, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the cotton plants. But inside the small storage building, time seemed suspended, as if the normal rules of their world had been temporarily set aside. Samuel remained pressed against the wall of the tub, his body tense with fear and confusion. Every instinct told him to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Every survival skill he had learned told him to submit, to apologize, to make himself as small and unthreatening as possible. But Margaret's presence here, her obvious violation of every social norm that governed their world, had created a situation that defied his understanding. Margaret stood near the door, her hand still resting on the latch as if she might flee at any moment. Her carefully arranged hair had begun to come loose in the humid air, and her usually perfect composure was showing cracks. She looked at Samuel, really looked at him, for the first time in her life, seeing not property but a person. "You're afraid of me," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied honestly. There was no point in lying. "You should be," Margaret said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "I could have you killed with a word. I could say you attacked me, tried to rape me, and no one would question my story." "I know," Samuel said quietly, "but I could also—" Margaret paused, struggling with words for concepts she had never allowed herself to consider. "I could also choose not to say those things." The implication hung in the air between them. Margaret was acknowledging, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she had choices beyond the script that Southern society had written for her. She could choose to see Samuel as human. She could choose to recognize his dignity. She could choose to question the system that had shaped both of their lives. But choices, Samuel knew, were luxuries that enslaved people could rarely afford. "What do you want from me?" Samuel asked, his voice steady despite his fear. Margaret moved closer, her silk dress rustling in the humid air. "I want to understand," she said. "I want to know what it's like to be you." The request was so unexpected, so far outside the normal parameters of master-slave interaction, that Samuel didn't know how to respond. In his world, white people didn't ask enslaved people about their experiences or feelings. They gave orders and expected obedience, nothing more. "Ma'am," Samuel said carefully, "I don't think that's something you really want to know." "Why not?" "Because," Samuel said, finding strength in honesty, "if you really understood what it was like to be me, you couldn't go on living the way you do." Margaret felt Samuel's words like a physical blow. The truth in them was undeniable, and it forced her to confront the comfortable lies she had been telling herself for her entire life. She had always believed that the enslaved people on her plantation were well treated, that they were grateful for the security and care that bondage provided, that the system of slavery was ultimately beneficial for everyone involved. But looking at Samuel now, seeing the fear in his eyes, the tension in his body, the careful way he chose his words, she could no longer maintain those illusions. The young man before her was not grateful for his bondage. He was not content with his lot in life. He was a person trapped in an inhuman system, surviving through a combination of intelligence, strength, and sheer force of will. "Tell me," Margaret said, moving closer still. "Tell me what it's like." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, weighing the risks of honesty against the strange opportunity that her question presented. In all his years of bondage, no white person had ever asked him about his inner life, his thoughts, his feelings. The request was so unprecedented that he wasn't sure how to respond. "You want to know what it's like?" Samuel asked finally. "It's like drowning every day but never being allowed to die. It's like being hungry all the time, not just for food but for everything, for choice, for dignity, for the right to be human. It's like watching your life pass by while someone else decides every detail of how you'll spend it." Margaret listened to his words, feeling each one like a weight settling on her chest. She had never considered the psychological toll of slavery, the way it affected not just the body but the mind and spirit of those who endured it. "But you survive," she said. "You keep going." "Because the alternative is death," Samuel replied. "And because sometimes in moments like this, I remember that I'm still human, even if the world tries to tell me otherwise." The admission created a moment of connection between them that transcended the boundaries of race and class. Margaret recognized in Samuel's words something of her own experience, the feeling of being trapped by circumstances beyond her control, of having her life shaped by forces she couldn't influence. "I understand that feeling," she said quietly, "the feeling of drowning." Samuel looked at her with surprise. "Ma'am?" "My life," Margaret said, the words coming slowly as if she were discovering them as she spoke, "is not my own either. Every day is planned for me, every decision made by someone else. I'm property too in my own way, valuable property, well cared for property, but property nonetheless." The comparison was both illuminating and problematic. While Margaret's constraints were real, they were nothing compared to the brutal reality of chattel slavery. She lived in luxury built on the suffering of others, and her limitations were those of privilege rather than oppression. But Samuel recognized the grain of truth in her words. The system that enslaved him also constrained her, though in vastly different ways. Both of them were trapped by a social order that denied them full humanity. Him through the complete negation of his personhood, her through the narrow definition of acceptable womanhood that Southern society imposed. "It ain't the same thing," Samuel said gently but firmly. "You got choices I'll never have. You got power I'll never see. But I understand feeling trapped." Margaret moved closer to the tub, close enough now that she could see the scars on Samuel's back, the calluses on his hands, the physical evidence of a life spent in forced labor. The reality of his suffering was written on his body in ways that made her comfortable abstractions impossible to maintain. "Those scars," she said, her voice barely audible. "How did you get them?" Samuel's jaw tightened. The scars were from a whipping he had received 2 years earlier, punishment for the crime of looking directly at a white woman who had spoken to him. The irony of discussing those scars with another white woman who was now looking directly at him was not lost on either of them. "Hutchins," Samuel said simply, "for forgetting my place." "What did you do?" "Looked up when Mrs. Patterson from the next plantation spoke to me. Forgot to keep my eyes down." Margaret felt sick. She knew Mrs. Patterson had entertained her in this very house. The idea that a human being had been brutally whipped for the simple act of making eye contact was almost too horrible to comprehend. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry don't heal scars," Samuel replied, but his tone was not unkind. "And sorry don't change the system that made them." The truth of his words hung between them like a challenge. Margaret's apology, however sincere, was meaningless in the face of the ongoing reality of slavery. Words of regret from the beneficiaries of oppression could never undo the damage that oppression caused. "What would change it?" Margaret asked. "What would make it better?" Samuel looked at her with something approaching amazement. The question revealed a naivety that was almost breathtaking in its scope. How could someone who had lived her entire life surrounded by slavery not understand its fundamental nature? "Freedom," Samuel said simply. "The only thing that would make it better is freedom. Not better treatment, not kinder masters, not more comfortable chains. Freedom." The word hung in the air between them like a forbidden incantation. In the world of the antebellum South, the idea of freedom for enslaved people was not just radical, it was revolutionary. It threatened the entire economic and social structure that provided wealth and power to people like Margaret and her husband. "But if you were free," Margaret said, struggling with concepts she had never seriously considered, "what would you do? Where would you go?" The questions revealed the depth of her conditioning. She had been taught to believe that enslaved people were incapable of caring for themselves, that they needed the guidance and protection that slavery provided. The idea that they might have their own goals, dreams, and plans was foreign to her worldview. "I'd learn to read," Samuel said without hesitation. "I'd find work that paid me wages for my labor. I'd choose where to live and who to love. I'd make decisions about my own life instead of having them made for me." Each item on his list was a simple human desire, but in the context of slavery, each one was a radical demand. The right to education, to fair compensation for labor, to freedom of movement and association, these were privileges that white society reserved for itself. "And you'd be happy?" Margaret asked. "I'd be human," Samuel replied, "and that's all any of us really want, the chance to be human." Margaret felt the weight of Samuel's words settling over her like a heavy blanket. For the first time in her life, she was being forced to confront the full humanity of someone she had been taught to see as property. The experience was both enlightening and devastating, opening her eyes to truths she had spent her entire life avoiding. But recognition of truth and the ability to act on that truth were two very different things. Margaret might now understand the horror of slavery in a way she never had before, but she was still the governor's wife, still the beneficiary of a system built on human bondage, still trapped within the constraints of her own social position. "If I could change things," she said slowly, "if I had the power to make it different, I would." Samuel looked at her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "But you can't," he said, "and even if you could, you wouldn't. Because changing things would mean giving up everything you have, everything you are." The accusation was gentle but devastating in its accuracy. Margaret might feel sympathy for Samuel's plight, might even recognize the injustice of his situation, but she would not sacrifice her own comfort and security to address that injustice. Her recognition of his humanity was real, but it was not strong enough to overcome her investment in the system that oppressed him. "You're right," Margaret admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I'm a coward." "You're human," Samuel said, and there was no judgment in his voice. "Humans protect themselves first. That's just the way people are." The conversation had reached a point of brutal honesty that neither of them had expected. They had moved beyond the roles that society had assigned them, master and slave, white and black, oppressor and oppressed, and had encountered each other as flawed, complex human beings. But the roles were still there, waiting to reclaim them the moment they stepped back into the world outside this small room. The system that had shaped their lives had not changed, and their brief moment of human connection could not alter the fundamental realities of their situation. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the governor's wife but a woman trapped in her own kind of prison. "Now you go back to your big house," he said quietly, "and I go back to the quarters, and we both pretend this never happened. And if I wanted to see you again?" The question revealed the dangerous territory they had entered. Margaret's interest in Samuel had moved beyond curiosity into something more personal, more intimate. But any relationship between them, no matter how it was framed, would be built on the foundation of absolute power imbalance that defined their world. "Then you'd be proving that everything I thought about white folks is true," Samuel said, his voice hardening slightly. "That you see us as things for your entertainment, your pleasure, your guilt. That even when you think you're being kind, you're still just using us." Margaret felt Samuel's words like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the comfortable self-deception that had sustained her throughout her life. She had entered this room thinking of herself as different from other white people, more enlightened, more capable of seeing beyond the prejudices of her society. But Samuel's accusation forced her to confront the truth about her motivations. Had she come here out of genuine concern for his humanity, or was she simply seeking something for herself, a momentary escape from her own emptiness, a brief taste of the forbidden, a way to feel morally superior to her peers? The honest answer was uncomfortable, and it revealed the depth of her conditioning in ways that mere intellectual recognition could not. "I thought," she began, then stopped, unable to complete the sentence. "You thought you could take what you wanted and call it kindness," Samuel said, his voice gaining strength. "You thought you could satisfy your curiosity about how the other half lives without giving up any of your comfort or privilege. You thought you could feel good about yourself for recognizing my humanity while still benefiting from the system that denies it." Each accusation was accurate, and Margaret felt the weight of her own hypocrisy settling over her like a shroud. She had indeed come here seeking something for herself, using Samuel's vulnerability for her own emotional needs, while offering nothing real in return. "But what if I wanted to help?" Margaret asked, grasping for some way to redeem herself. "What if I wanted to make things better for you?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. "Help how? By giving me extra food? By making sure Hutchins doesn't whip me as often? By treating me like a pet instead of property?" The questions revealed the fundamental impossibility of reform within the system of slavery. Any improvement in Samuel's conditions would still leave him enslaved, still deny him his basic humanity, still treat him as something less than a full person. Kindness from masters could never substitute for freedom. "The only help I need," Samuel continued, "is the kind you'll never give, the kind that would cost you everything you have." Margaret knew he was right. True help would mean working to end slavery entirely, and that would require her to give up the wealth, status, and security that the system provided. It would mean betraying her own class, her own family, her own husband. It would mean sacrificing everything she had ever known for the sake of people she had been taught to see as inferior. And she knew, with a certainty that shamed her, that she would never make that sacrifice. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Both Margaret and Samuel understood that they had reached the limits of what their brief connection could accomplish. Recognition of shared humanity was not enough to bridge the chasm that slavery had created between them. Margaret moved towards the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. Once she opened that door, once she stepped back into the world outside, this moment would be over. She would return to being the governor's wife, the perfect Southern lady, the woman who smiled and nodded and never questioned the foundation of her world. But she would also return to being the oppressor, the owner of human beings, the beneficiary of a system built on suffering. And Samuel would return to being property, his brief moment of recognition as a human being swallowed up by the brutal reality of his bondage. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "I know," Samuel replied, and there was no anger in his voice, only sadness. "But sorry, don't change nothing." Margaret opened the door, but hesitated before stepping through it. The evening air felt different now, charged with the weight of what had passed between them. She looked back at Samuel, who was reaching for his clothes with hands that shook slightly. "Samuel," she said, using his name for the first time. "Yes, ma'am." "You were right, about all of it." She stepped outside then, closing the door behind her, and leaving Samuel alone in the small room that had been his sanctuary, his prison, and, finally, his place of unexpected recognition. The sound of her footsteps faded as she walked back toward the main house, back to her life of privilege built on the suffering of others. Samuel dressed slowly, his hands still trembling from the encounter. He had survived, but more than that, he had spoken truth to power and lived to tell about it. It was a small victory in a life that offered few, but it was his own. As Samuel prepared to leave the storage building, he carried with him something new. Not hope, exactly, but a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped his world. Margaret's visit had revealed not just her own contradictions and limitations, but the fundamental impossibility of reform within the system of slavery. He had seen behind the mask of Southern womanhood and found not a monster, but a human being trapped in her own kind of prison. It didn't excuse her participation in his oppression, didn't make the system any less brutal, but it added a layer of complexity to his understanding of how oppression worked. The real tragedy was not that Margaret was evil, but that she was ordinary. She was a product of her society, shaped by its values and constrained by its expectations. Her inability to transcend those limitations was not a personal failing so much as a systemic one. The system of slavery was designed to corrupt everyone it touched, oppressor and oppressed alike. Samuel stepped out of the building and began walking back toward the slave quarters, where the other enslaved people were settling in for the night. The familiar sounds of conversation, children playing, and evening routines provided a stark contrast to the intensity of what had just occurred. As he walked, Samuel thought about the conversation he had just had and what it meant for his future. Margaret now knew things about him that could be dangerous: his intelligence, his desire for freedom, his ability to articulate the injustices of his situation. That knowledge could be used against him if she chose to share it with her husband or the overseers. But Samuel also sensed that Margaret would keep their encounter secret, not out of concern for his safety, but out of concern for her own reputation. The revelation that she had sought out a private meeting with an enslaved man would be scandalous enough to destroy her social standing, regardless of what had actually occurred. Margaret's walk back to the main house felt like a journey through a different world. The familiar sights and sounds of the plantation, the white-painted mansion, the manicured gardens, the distant lights of the slave quarters, all looked different now, charged with new meaning and new horror. She had spent her entire life surrounded by the evidence of slavery's brutality, but she had trained herself not to see it. The scars on the bodies of the house slaves, The exhaustion in their faces, the careful way they moved and spoke in the presence of white people, all of these things had been invisible to her, filtered out by a worldview that required their suffering to be either justified or ignored. But Samuel's words had stripped away those filters, forcing her to see the reality of the system that provided her with comfort and security. The knowledge was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the price that others paid for her privilege. As she entered the house, Margaret was greeted by Bessie, the enslaved woman who served as head cook. "Evening, Miss Margaret," Bessie said with the practiced deference that slavery demanded. "Dinner's ready whenever you want it." Margaret looked at Bessie, really looked at her for the first time in years. She saw the intelligence in the older woman's eyes, carefully hidden behind a mask of subservience. She saw the strength in her bearing, the dignity that survived despite decades of bondage. She saw a human being who had been reduced to property, whose thoughts and feelings and dreams were considered irrelevant by the world around her. "Thank you, Bessie," Margaret said, her voice catching slightly. I'll be there shortly." Bessie looked at her with concern. "You feeling all right, Miss Margaret? You look a little peaked." The kindness in Bessie's voice, the genuine concern from someone who had every reason to hate her, was almost more than Margaret could bear. How many times had Bessie shown her such consideration? How many small acts of humanity had she ignored or taken for granted? "I'm fine," Margaret lied. "Just tired." But she wasn't fine, and she would never be fine again. The comfortable ignorance that had sustained her for 32 years was gone, replaced by a knowledge that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Over the following days, life on the Whitmore plantation continued according to its established rhythms. Governor Whitmore returned from Montgomery with news of political developments and legislative business. The enslaved workers continued their labor in the cotton fields under Hutchins' watchful eye. The house slaves maintained the domestic routines that kept the plantation running smoothly. But beneath the surface continuity, something had changed. Margaret found herself watching the enslaved people around her with new eyes, seeing their humanity in ways that made her previous blindness impossible to reclaim. Every interaction was now charged with the knowledge of what she had learned in that small storage building. Samuel returned to his work in the fields, his body moving through the familiar motions of cotton picking, while his mind processed the implications of his encounter with Margaret. He watched for any sign that she might have revealed their conversation to her husband or the overseers, but none came. The secret remained between them, a shared burden that neither could escape. The two of them occasionally crossed paths in the normal course of plantation life, when Samuel was assigned to work near the main house, when Margaret walked through the yard on her daily inspections. But they never spoke, never acknowledged what had passed between them. The roles that society had assigned them had reasserted themselves, and the brief moment of human connection was buried beneath the weight of social expectation. Yet both carried the memory of that encounter, and it changed them in ways that would last for the rest of their lives. Margaret could never again pretend that enslaved people were anything less than fully human, and Samuel had experienced a moment of recognition that proved his humanity could not be completely erased by the system that oppressed him. Years would pass before the system of slavery finally crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions and the pressure of those who fought against it. The Civil War would come, bringing with it the destruction of the world that Margaret and Samuel had known. The plantation system would collapse, the Confederacy would fall, and the enslaved people of the South would finally taste the freedom that Samuel had described in that small storage building. But the encounter between Margaret and Samuel had planted seeds that would grow long before that larger transformation occurred. Margaret would never become an abolitionist. The constraints of her position and the limitations of her courage would prevent such a dramatic conversion. But she would never again be able to participate in the casual cruelty of slavery with the same unconscious ease. Small acts of kindness, carefully hidden from her husband and the overseers, would become her way of managing the guilt that Samuel's words had awakened. Extra food smuggled to the quarters, medical care provided without questions, punishments quietly reduced or delayed. These were not acts of rebellion, but they were acts of recognition, acknowledgments of the humanity she could no longer deny. Samuel would carry the memory of that conversation as proof that even in the darkest circumstances, truth could be spoken and heard. The knowledge that he had forced a white woman to confront the reality of slavery, that he had made her see him as human, would sustain him through the remaining years of his bondage. When freedom finally came, Samuel would be among those who seized it with both hands, learning to read as he had always dreamed, working for wages that belonged to him, making choices about his own life. The dignity that had survived slavery would flourish in freedom, and the young man who had spoken truth to power in a small storage building would become a leader in his community. The locked door that had brought Margaret and Samuel together had been both literal and metaphorical. It had created a space where the normal rules of their society were temporarily suspended, where two people trapped in different ways by the same cruel system could encounter each other as human beings. But it had also revealed the limitations of individual recognition within a system of institutional oppression. Margaret's acknowledgement of Samuel's humanity, however genuine, could not free him from bondage. Samuel's articulation of slavery's horrors, however powerful, could not transform Margaret into an agent of change. The real tragedy of their encounter was not that it failed to change everything, but that it revealed how little individual enlightenment could accomplish in the face of systemic injustice. The recognition of shared humanity was necessary but not sufficient. It had to be coupled with collective action, political change, and the willingness to sacrifice privilege for principle. Margaret would live the rest of her life carrying the burden of knowledge without the courage to act on it fully. She would die in 1847, 26 years after that fateful evening, having never publicly questioned the system that had given her wealth and status. Her private acts of kindness would be remembered by some of the enslaved people she had helped, but they would not be enough to absolve her of complicity in their oppression. Samuel would survive slavery and live to see the Emancipation Proclamation, dying in 1889 as a free man who had built a life of dignity and purpose. He would become a teacher, using the literacy he had fought so hard to achieve to educate other formerly enslaved people. He would marry, have children, and experience the full range of human relationships that slavery had denied him. But he would never forget the evening when a white woman had locked a door and forced both of them to confront truths they had been avoiding. The memory would serve as both a reminder of how far he had come and a warning about how easily progress could be reversed. The story of Margaret and Samuel was not unique. Across the antebellum South, similar encounters occurred. Moments when the carefully constructed barriers between white and black, master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, temporarily cracked to reveal the shared humanity beneath. Most of these encounters remained hidden, buried beneath the weight of social taboo and the fear of consequences. Some led to relationships that challenged the boundaries of their society, though always within the context of fundamental power imbalance. Others led to violence, as the recognition of enslaved people's humanity threatened the psychological foundations that made slavery possible for white people. But all of them contributed to the growing tension that would eventually tear the nation apart. The contradiction between American ideals of freedom and equality and the reality of chattel slavery could not be sustained indefinitely. Each moment of recognition, each crack in the facade of racial hierarchy, added pressure to a system that was ultimately unsustainable. The Civil War, when it came, would be fought over many issues: states' rights, economic systems, political power. But at its heart, it would be a war over the question that Margaret and Samuel had grappled with in that small storage building: whether black people were fully human and deserving of the same rights and freedoms as white people. The locked door that had brought Margaret and Samuel together had opened something that could never be completely closed again: the recognition that the system of slavery was built on a lie. The lie that some people were naturally suited for bondage, that racial hierarchy was ordained by God or nature, that the suffering of enslaved people was justified by their supposed inferiority. Once that lie was exposed, once the full humanity of enslaved people was acknowledged, the entire edifice of slavery became morally indefensible. It might continue to exist through force and habit, but it could no longer claim moral legitimacy. This was the true power of encounters like the one between Margaret and Samuel. Not that they immediately changed the world, but that they planted seeds of truth that would eventually grow into movements for justice. The recognition of shared humanity was the first step toward the recognition of equal rights, and equal rights were incompatible with the institution of slavery. The young man who had spoken truth to power in a storage building behind a plantation house had done more than survive an encounter with his oppressor. He had forced her to see him as human, and in doing so had struck a blow against the entire system that sought to deny his humanity. The woman who had locked the door seeking something she couldn't name had found something she hadn't expected, the knowledge that her comfortable world was built on the suffering of people who were no different from herself in any meaningful way. That knowledge would haunt her for the rest of her life, but it would also make her a slightly better person, even if it couldn't make her a truly good one. The story of Margaret and Samuel raises questions that extend far beyond the antebellum South, questions that remain relevant in any society where inequality and injustice persist. How do we reconcile our knowledge of others' suffering with our investment in systems that benefit us? How do we move from recognition of injustice to action against it? How do we balance our individual comfort with our collective responsibility? These questions have no easy answers, and the story of Margaret and Samuel offers no simple solutions. What it does offer is a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human connection is possible, truth can be spoken, and dignity can survive. The locked door that brought them together was both a barrier and an opening, a barrier that separated them from the outside world and its rigid rules, and an opening that allowed them to see each other clearly for perhaps the first time in their lives. In that brief space of honesty and vulnerability, they had encountered each other not as master and slave, but as two human beings trying to make sense of an inhuman world. It was not enough to change everything, but it was enough to change them. And sometimes, in the long arc of history, that is how justice begins, not with grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but with small moments of recognition, individual acts of courage, and the gradual accumulation of truth that eventually becomes too powerful to ignore. The sun that had risen over the Whitmore plantation on that August morning in 1821 had set on a world that looked the same, but was fundamentally different. Two people had seen each other clearly, spoken honestly, and acknowledged their shared humanity despite the system that sought to deny it. The locked door had opened something that would never be completely closed again. The possibility that things could be different, that people could be better, that justice could eventually prevail. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. In the suffocating heat of an Alabama summer in 1821, behind a locked door in a small storage building, two people discovered that the most revolutionary act in an oppressive system is simply seeing each other as human beings. This story reminds us that while individual recognition cannot immediately dismantle systemic injustice, it plants the seeds of truth that eventually grow into movements for change. The tragedy is not that Margaret and Samuel couldn't immediately transform their world, it's that we still live in a world where such transformations are necessary. Their brief encounter across the chasm of slavery offers both hope and warning. Hope that human connection can survive even the most dehumanizing systems, and warning that recognition without action is a burden that haunts us long after the moment of truth has passed. If this story moved you to think deeply about power, dignity, and our responsibility to confront uncomfortable truths about our past and present, please subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How do we ensure that moments of recognition become catalysts for justice rather than merely sources of guilt? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these essential stories to light. Remember, the most important stories are often the most difficult ones. They force us to confront not just the failures of the past, but our own complicity in the injustices of the present. The locked door that trapped Margaret and Samuel also opened a space for truth, and truth, however painful, is always the first step toward justice. Historical note: this story is a work of fiction, but it is grounded in the historical realities of slavery in the antebellum American South. While the characters of Margaret and Samuel are fictional, their experiences reflect the documented lives of real people who lived under the system of chattel slavery. The story aims to illuminate the human cost of this institution while respecting the dignity of those who suffered under it.